Michaela, or Happy New Year. Today is the Lunar New Year, which is what most Asian and Chinese countries will follow, meaning that it is now the year of the monkey. Goodbye, year of the sheep. In celebration of the New Year, I'm wearing red. As you can see, I will be eating dumplings with my family that I made from scratch, and I will be reviewing the Three-Body Problem by Cixin Liu. This book was translated by Ken Liu, and there is a translator's note at the back of the book, and from what I can tell, he subscribes to the same theory of translation that I do, that you shouldn't stick strictly to either an accurate representation of the word choice or an accurate representation of the feeling and sentiment of the book. You must blend both in various situations depending on what is going on in the story, because you need to think about the audience that is going to be reading it, and think about what the original purpose was, and all of these things. So if you have a translated book and there is a translator's note, I would recommend reading it, because they talk about how they tackle the translation, and it might give you some insight into what the original might have been different in. So definitely read that. This one also has a letter from the author to the American audience, or the English-speaking audience, as well. So those were both very interesting. I did have a problem in that there is something that is mentioned on the back of the book that doesn't show up until more than like 250 pages into the book, and I always hate when that happens. Really, there shouldn't be anything on the back of the book that isn't in the first 100 pages. And the reason I have a problem with that is that in a lot of ways this book reads like a mystery, which we all know I really enjoy. Mystery is one of my favorite genres, and this is a mix of mystery and science fiction, except for the fact that I knew what the result of the mystery was because of the back of the book. So if you haven't heard anything about this book, I'm not going to talk about that part because I feel like it's a spoiler, and I would recommend not reading the back of the book and instead listening to this, because this will be a spoiler-free review. I have to say that for this book, it took me a while to get into it, and that is because it is science fiction, emphasis on science. Cixin Liu was an engineer before he was a writer, so he did physics and all of that stuff, and this book is very math and theory based. And luckily Ken Liu, the translator, also has a background in science, so he is able to translate that in a way that is understandable. But if you are not a person like Gretchen, who doesn't like being bogged down with all of the science and explanation behind everything, you might want to steer clear from this one. However, this is maybe one of the best science fiction books I've ever read, and it would seem that the judges of the Hugo Award agree with me, because it won that, but it's such a good book. After about 100 pages, it really sped up, and it kept me engaged even with all of the science that was going on. This book primarily goes around two characters, the first one being Ye Wenjie. She is sort of both in the past and the present as a physicist working on an army base. The second sort of protagonist here is Wang Miao, and Wang Miao is a nanophysicist, nanoparticle researcher, some nanomaterial researcher, and he is only in the present day, and he's sort of our detective in this case. He's just a scientist. He sort of gets dragged into both sides of this story, wherein there's a military saying that we're at war with people, but there's no war going on, nobody's quite sure what's going on, and you're finding out both what Ye Wenjie was doing in the past at this army base, and how it is affecting the present of this book, which is the 21st century. The book starts in the Cultural Revolution with Ye Wenjie's father basically being beaten to death by his students. Now, this is something that actually happened. It is an actual period in Chinese history where basically Chairman Mao Zedong actually pushed students and young people to fight back against what were considered the five enemies of communism or of the government, one of which were intellectuals, which included teachers and professors. He actually shut down colleges and high schools and even middle schools, so that all of these kids could seek out these people and either humiliate them into committing suicide, or in this case actually beating them to death in front of his daughter, who ends up having to fake her part in this revolution. She eventually gets called a counter-revolutionary, which means that she is forever marked as working against the communist regime, which is bad for her. However, it then goes from there into sort of the modern day, or an alternate version of the modern day, and begins talking about stuff from there. Like I said, this is a very science-heavy book. It talks a lot about the physics that she's doing, a lot about the physics involved with what Wang Miao's doing in the present day, but it also involves a very interesting video game called The Three-Body Problem, which is where the title of this book comes from. And I honestly am surprised that that didn't show up on the back of this book, because majority of this book takes place within the three-body problem, and it's an interesting look at the different ways that people looked at science throughout history, and how it was that we came to become at this point. A lot of the themes of this book are focusing on how science is either moving through slow progression of building on top of building on top of building, with these new theories and new processes, or through giant leaps forward, where one thing leads to a huge stack of new discoveries and moves everything forward really quickly. The way to think about this is the way that we went from, like, the Industrial Revolution to the Information Age in less time than it took to go from the, like, agricultural age to the Industrial Revolution. Exponentially, we're speeding up our technology and our science because we have these great leaps forward that improve our technology, improve our science. And so it's a discussion of how that fits humanity, whether it's good for humanity. It discusses the problems that come along with it, whether we need the new technology or if it's just going to perpetuate war and things like that. And it uses sort of the Cultural Revolution as sort of a backdrop of, like, a negative of certain aspects, and takes different stances on that. Outside of that, I would say if you are worried about reading this book, because I just said a bunch of Chinese names, there is a page at the front of this book that lets you know who all of the characters are, and I think that was another really smart thing to have. There's a list of the characters. I know that when I'm reading books from a culture that I'm not familiar with, one of the hardest parts is telling people apart, because their names are just sounds in a way. They're not tangible. I can't see Bobby, Susie, like things that I recognize. So having that page lets you know, okay, so this is this character, this is this character, this is how they relate to the story. It's extremely helpful, and I would say that after 100 pages in, you should be able to tell who everyone is, and what they're talking about. On top of that, the translator has put in footnotes. I don't know if you can see those right here. We have some footnotes that will describe certain physics things that are going on, certain political characters that are referenced that you might not understand, certain historical events that you also might not understand. He knows that not everyone in America or England or wherever you are reading this is going to get all of the references to the Chinese people, whereas people in China would understand those references. They're very well known people in politics, etc. So if you are worried about not understanding that, you can definitely find that information in the footnotes, as well as online. You can always Google it if you aren't sure who a person is that they're referencing, who's a political mind or a philosophical mind or whatever, because there are a lot of them in here. Overall, this is one of the best science fiction books that I've read ever, and I don't read a lot of science fiction, which is surprising because I do enjoy it for the most part, so maybe I should rectify that and look into dipping into more science fiction. If you have some good science fiction books that you would recommend to me, I would love that, so please tell me what you think would be good for me to read. I would like those recommendations, and I hope that you enjoyed this review. That's all I have for you guys today. I will see you tomorrow when Gretchen and I do a TBR for our hashtag Read Your Own Damn Books challenge. 恭喜发财, also known as happiness and prosperity to you in the new year. Happy Lunar New Year, you guys.